All right, so hello everyone. Happy New Year and welcome back to STATEC Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. In case this is your first time, I'm Kelsey O'Connor, I'm one of the organizers. We also have Chiara Peroni and Francesco Saracino online. So today we are pleased to have Dr. Thomas Gibon speak to us about decarbonizing Luxembourg and the implications. Thomas will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. And during the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and the past recordings on the website and our YouTube channel. And to introduce Dr. Thomas Gibon. So Thomas is a researcher at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, where his research activities involve environmental impact assessments at the product and territorial scales of energy systems, mobility, buildings, and financial instruments. He regularly publishes articles in academic outlets and has contributed to several UN reports, such as the 5th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 2 UN Environmental Program reports on the impacts of electricity generation and usage, and a UN Economic Commission for Europe report on electricity technologies. Thomas is also involved in dissemination activities through talks on carbon footprint and the environmental impacts of our lifestyle, both for students and broader audience such as this one. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas Gibon. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kelsey, for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar series, especially the first of the year. I'm glad to be here. For the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to explore how we can actually characterize Luxembourg, but in terms of climate impacts, and try to understand what we can do to reduce this climate impact. You may or may not know that Luxembourg is one of the highest, let's say, most carbon intensive countries in the world in terms of per capita quantities, of course, and which means there's probably a lot of work to do. We need to do this while keeping, of course, our social, social security and all the social aspects of the life we live here, keep the quality of life and well-being. And that implies probably some drastic changes that we'll talk about in the second part of the presentation. And hopefully we have time at the end for questions and discussion. Just some context of what I'm going to show you. I have to apologize first to those who already saw this at a previous STATEC webinar last year. Most of the slides are reused, and I've added some details for the people who like details. But the context of this is a project, and it's more than a project, it's a consultation called Luxembourg in Transition, that was the initiative of the Ministry of Energy. So Minister Claude Thomas initiated this, where we had a 3-stage consultation. The team who were part of, first there were 11 teams answering this consultation. The team we were part of was actually composed mostly of architects, of urban planners, of geographs, and us, engineers, researchers, whatever you want to call it. But we were trying to keep track of all the plans that were made by the rest of the team, but in terms of CO2 equivalent, in terms of land use, in terms of other indicators like that, to make sure we were going according to plan and that we were not imagining something that were not climate compatible. Yeah, I can talk about the team probably a bit later, but it was quite a nice multidisciplinary team. The main objective of this work was to find out what were the best pathways to decarbonize Luxembourg. The objective was to reduce our personal carbon footprint from about 15 tons of CO2 equivalent per year to 1.6, which is a level that's low enough that we can plan on having enough carbon uptake to balance it out and to have a net zero future, a net zero carbon footprint in 2050. Of course, we have to consider resilience. So we also have to keep within environmental boundaries when it comes to land use, emissions of eutrophication substances such as nitrate, phosphate, and also other things like ecotoxic compounds. what else? Air pollution, water use, whatever you can think of, which puts a lot of constraints on these scenarios, right? In at the same time keeping our minimal social and environmental foundation, which can actually be more, let's say, better represented by something you may know, which is the donut model, which really shows that we need to keep within our environmental boundaries while satisfying the foundation of social and environmental expectations. At this point, there's not many things we actually have quantified, so maybe that's where we could probably be more collaborating in terms of social justice, well-being, and what we considered life satisfaction, which I think is probably what we meant at this point, and how we actually put numbers on that. Numbers we can put easily on greenhouse gas emissions, material use, air pollution. That's what we do in terms of our job. But really, that was our main. That was the matrix for the rest of the project and the main thread for the 3 reports we produced. So without further ado, I'll show you the next part, which is actually the first part of the project, which is where do we stand today? So what's the balance of carbon in Luxembourg? What is the actual state of play at the moment? We know for a fact that transport dominates territorial emissions in Luxembourg. So all the CO2 that we emit is actually coming from industry, residential, final consumers, commercial activities, and mostly transport, because of a weird statistical effect that we have sales of fuels accounted for Luxembourg, even though this fuel is combusted and burnt outside of the boundaries, still accounts for emissions within the boundaries of Luxembourg. So the objective right now is to halve these emissions between 2019 and 2030. This gives us a first path to follow. But we have to remember that even though these numbers already seem quite high, they are only the emissions that happen within the boundaries. And when we start taking into account supply chains and the fact that we in Luxembourg import a lot from other countries, we also export, by the way, a lot. It actually depicts a different picture. This we try to represent in this matrix. I hope it's not too hard to interpret. I will take some time to explain, but it's actually a matrix of indirect greenhouse gas emissions embodied in trade between Luxembourg and other regions, either near or far. So basically we have Luxembourg here in a row. So everything coming here would be the emissions embodied in products that are from Luxembourg, and everything in a column that will be all the emissions embodied in products that go towards Luxembourg. What we see is that when we plot and when we actually calculate all the emissions coming from Luxembourg, we end up with the territorial emissions, because that's exactly what's being produced within the boundaries. That's about 10.4 million tons of CO2. But most of the stuff we make is actually going somewhere else. Only 2.5 million tons of CO2 stay in Luxembourg. 2.3 go to the rest of Europe, 3.1 go to the rest of the world, and some to our neighbors. And at the same time, we also import from other regions. Luxembourg imports from Europe, from the rest of the world mostly. And some examples of industries whose supply chains are really internationalized is the steel industry. We export a lot to Europe, for example. The car industry is actually responsible for most of the emissions embodied in imports from Germany, among others. And we also have, fossil fuels. So this data was from 2018. So we still had a lot of fossil fuels coming from Russia. Hopefully it has changed. I don't have any better data than that, especially not for 2022, but I would be very curious to see how it changed. And what we see is that the picture is actually much more complex than we thought. If we want to decarbonize, we can, of course, decarbonize whatever happens within the boundaries of Luxembourg, but we should probably decarbonize what we consume. Because it's one thing to reduce your emissions, but it's another one to reduce the emissions of everything associated with your consumption. So for that, for these calculations, we use a database called XRBase. It's a multi-regional input-output model. I know some of you at STATEC do input-output modeling with 49 regions. So it's quite good representation of the world with 200 products, 60 sectors, whatever. And what's important is that you can have environmental extensions and you can actually attach CO2 factors to every sector, to every euro of every sector of every country in the world. And that way you can actually trace back supply chains. It takes monetary transaction as a proxy for supply chains, which is the best we could have. But of course, the physical description of the world would be even better, but that's another question. I have some notebooks, if you're familiar with this, written in Python to do the exact same calculations if you want to try it yourself. And in terms of methods, it's what I would, it's input-output modeling 101, where you actually start from all the transactions between all sectors and all countries in the world. You look at your final demand, and you actually can calculate what is the total output necessary to satisfy this final demand. And this total output can be associated with its emissions. So yeah, and if you want to trace emissions, you have some linear algebra to go through. So yeah, if you really like this, we can talk about it afterwards. There was another nice representation that was made by another team. We did exactly the same kind of calculations, where you actually see where emissions come from when we consume in Luxembourg. It's quite surprising that actually maybe, so here it's actually 3.6 million tons. We found a little less, but anyway, it's of the same order of emissions that happen, or sorry, the emissions that are linked with consumption in Luxembourg actually happen in Luxembourg. Everything else is either imported or exported. So yeah, 4.2 million tons are coming from Europe and 8.5 are coming from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world actually is mainly oil products. And when you actually look at the sectoral detail, but you also have finished products from China, USA, South Africa. There's a big flow of emissions coming from South African car industry that I still need to investigate. I didn't know, I mean, according to the data we have, there's a significant amount of cars coming from that country. It's also because it's a coal intensive country. So whatever you export from South Africa will have a high carbon emission embodied. So that's what we would call the top-down estimate of emissions in Luxembourg. But of course, you can do a bottom-up estimate and start from physical consumption in terms of kilogram from households, so kilogram, kilowatt hour, kilometers. And for that, we use a method called life cycle assessment, which shares a lot with input-output. Life cycle assessment is a method and a tool for attributing environmental impacts to products and services. You have for that to consider impacts over the full life cycle, so over the full supply chain, including the upstream, resource extraction, transport, etc. So we can define it as a holistic method. And typically you also consider hundreds, if not thousands, of emitted substances, extracted resources, considering a range of impact types. So you have different areas of protection, such as human health, ecosystem health, natural resource use, which correspond more or less to the outside of the donut we saw at the beginning. So it's multi-criteria at the same time. So it's, let's say, the best tool we have, the least bad tool we have to characterize environmental impacts of our consumption. Not only direct, of course, but indirect. And it's all the more important when you use, it's all the more important when you use so-called, clean, I would say clean, but clean technologies that have no emissions during the use phase, but where probably most of the emissions are coming from the upstream, production, assembly, transport, etc. So that's why we like this method. It's quite convenient to apply to new technologies such as wind power, for which you would have, for example, for a wind turbine, accounted for the emissions of CO2 and also probably toxic substances, air pollution in the raw material extraction, and then production of parts, transportation, construction, etc. And we have done this not in detail, because we also use databases that do the work for us for consumption in Luxembourg. Yeah, of course, you have some potential recycling. And then what you do is that you account for the total emissions, all scaled to 1 unit, or in this case, 1 kilowatt hour of your wind turbine. And that way you can compare technologies. Yeah, that's just to give you an example. It's quite interesting to read these kind of studies, but it's not the topic right now. This is just an example. Yeah, so we applied this to the consumption in Luxembourg with as a basis, as input data, the number of kilometers driven by car, by plane, etc. For housing, we would have the specific data coming from Luxembourgish statistics, of probably from you guys, for yeah, specific consumption in floor heating, space heating, according to the actual distribution of housing types in Luxembourg, with the correct energy mix for heating in Luxembourg, etc., and then calculate the total emissions. So this is about where we stand, or where we stood in 2019, but I don't expect that this has moved too much, unfortunately, since then. About 13 tons of CO2 equivalent per head per year. If you remember the slide, introductory slide on the project, we should be at about 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2050, which means putting all these boxes here into a square that would be about, yeah, half of the car one. And that's quite significant in terms of work, in terms of changes we need to see in society. And just to show that this is not always working, we have these emissions of consumption that would correspond to about this red bar here. So this is on the left, imports plus national inventory. All the emissions we have within Luxembourg plus the imports should equal everything that we consume plus everything that we export, right? But everything that we consume, if we take what we've seen just before, multiplied by the number of residents, we don't exactly match our consumption footprint that we find with the consumption calculation from the top-down input-output analysis. And that's because there's some side effects, I would call, from non-residents. Consumption of non-residents, there's also a lot of people that come into Luxembourg to consume during the day. These emissions will be probably allocated to the residents, even though they don't consume for themselves. So there's a bit of complications brought by the fact that Luxembourg is very well connected to other countries. So that's where we stand. At least it gives us a good picture of what Luxembourg looks like in terms of carbon emissions in 2019. Yeah, just this imbalance, but we know more or less where the imbalance is coming from. And now the question is what to do from there. So still using life cycle assessment, life cycle sustainability assessment methodology, which means that we actually look at full supply chains and not only at direct emissions. We calculate the emissions of the greater region. So we, instead of having just Luxembourg, we made the task a bit easier by including all the regions above so that we could include cross-border commuters. That would actually make it easier in terms of calculations. And then look at everything we could do in terms of mobility, housing, agriculture, consumption goods, and public sector. And from then on, we calculate the life cycle impacts on different environmental metrics. Greenhouse gas is obviously the first one. That's the main objective, so we have to keep track of it. It's a driver of the full project and set of propositions. Local air pollutants, nitrogen, phosphate. And we combine all of that to try to meet this Paris 2 degree agreement, which leaves us with 1.6 about ton CO2 equivalent per person in 2015. We also have to take into account the increase in population, which is probably where we diverged the most from STATEC scenarios, as we will see a bit later. And this suite of proposed interventions look like this for every category that you have seen in this carbon footprint figure: mobility, housing, food, consumption of discrete goods, and public service. We have declined a series of actions to undertake. A lot of them probably have an effect on well-being as we might think about it, but the proposition in this project is also to try to imagine a, a desirable future for Luxembourg and to think of better urban planning, better, a place where you would like to live, where you would love to live and have a life that is naturally low carbon by design. And that was also a big topic of the project. So yeah, the first interventions here are on electromobility, but we have pages of this that go through every topic. So extended bike network, for example, is one of these urban planning options that would probably increase well-being, as well as developing a naturally low carbon urban fabric where people would actually choose naturally to pick a bike because it might be easier than picking a car. And that way just kill two birds with one stone, be more healthy, emit less amount of carbon dioxide, and just choose to leave your car in the garage, on best live car free. So all these interventions, of course, don't have the same timeline. There are things you could probably do overnight, and there are things that require the infrastructure for you to start making that decision. So that's why we also have this timeline per category. Some of the main principles is also that we didn't want any new net land take. We don't want to build on arable land, for example, which means we will have to reduce living space per person, also expand the tram network, which we identified as one of the best ways to move people around in a fast fashion, and then densify and overbuild to prevent sprawl. It's quite a challenge. Luxembourg is the highest, has the highest rate of demographic increase in Europe. And yeah, not only in terms of resident, I think, but also in terms of job markets. So that's going to be quite a challenge to do. Yeah, but we'll come a bit after to talk about this. So in terms of sustainable mobility, for example, we imagined that the tram network, which is very small here in 2021 in green, could probably be extended to have to have a broader network, not only in the city, but to the main poles of job markets and where we see most people to live in the future as well. For that, we also have made maps. There's a lot of maps in this project for non-suitability and suitability places for urban densification. And in terms of population growth, we imagined, so we went actually commune by commune and imagine how growth could be envisaged to accommodate more people with maximum population density metrics. And that was made by a colleague who actually went through every commune and see what were the potential increase for each commune on the surface area of the commune, without, of course, adding new land take. That was quite a big part also of this project. Densification, as we saw, is probably required to meet our decarbonization targets. We cannot keep living with, I think we'll see it later, so it's a challenge for me, but 55 square meter per person, we would have to go under 40 in terms of usable floor area, at least with the objectives we had. So yeah, as I said, going from commune to commune to imagine the growth in population, depending on what could be done in terms of densification, and overbuilding. So we find something that looks very similar in terms of total amount of people, not living only, but working in Luxembourg. So here you have all the areas. It's not, of course, the whole countries, but it's all the areas of each country, of Belgium, of Germany, and France, that would be identified as being in a functional area. And where we differ the most is from you guys' numbers, is where people would live in France and in Luxembourg. We imagine that more people could actually live in France and less in Luxembourg. Of course, that comes with a lot of assumptions behind, mostly in terms of home office, in terms of different things that are not available today. but that's where we would locate people if we have to respect our suitability maps that we designed in the project. Of course, if we agree to have more net land take, then we could probably accommodate more people in Luxembourg. So it's also a question of what needs to be done politically to allow construction of a new land. So as I said, urban densification in our case would happen also mostly on the Thionville-Metz area, which is probably not the case in most other scenarios. Yeah, so just zooming back a bit, because I know this is a bit dense in information. What is our starting point for the functional region? So since now we're not looking at Luxembourg anymore, we want to know what's the carbon footprint of someone who lives in the region. We agreed on a number with the other teams at 16 towns. As we see here, I talked to you about the number that's probably around 13 or 14 for the carbon footprint of a Luxembourg resident. If you actually do this top-down calculation, which by definition integrates all the fuel consumption of cross-border commuters and of logistics, just trucks that come for fuel tourism in Luxembourg and go back, then your footprint in Luxembourg would be around 26, which we know is incorrect, but that's what global statistics will tell us. So we started with 16 here, and that's our functional area. 16, so that's actually 15.5 that we need to reduce down to 1.6. So we need to compress all these boxes to 1.6. The one I showed you earlier was for a Luxembourg resident, excluding all the statistical effect. This takes into account the statistical effect and it's for the greater region. So that's why you might see different numbers, but the idea is, of course, the same. And now we will go through the various measures, or the main measures, because we won't go through all of them, that we envisaged in terms of housing, of mobility, and a few others. So first, housing. The main impact of housing in Luxembourg, at least, is the heating, space heating. I think it's more than 2 tons per person. You have to know that Luxembourg is actually the highest, let's say the most fossil fuel using country in Europe in terms of space heating. I think 3/4 of the energy mix used for heating is either gas or fuel. I think it's about 50% gas and 25% fuel oil. And that needs to be reduced, obviously. The main tool we see for that is heat pumps. I'm going too fast. First, I explain. So what we use as a start is the EU reference scenario for the first year, where we use the population-weighted average of heating demand for the functional area. We extrapolate that future demand. We extrapolate the living space reduction that we expect, or that we assumed. That's going to be the next slide. And we assume new energy efficiency standards. And the most important, the shift in the fuel mix. Because it doesn't really matter if you do all this and you keep fuel oil and gas. You also have to switch most of the heating systems to low carbon ones, such as heat pumps or biomass for some of them, and possibly solar thermal. We have a very thin slice of solar thermal in those graphs, but we know that in Luxembourg, it's probably not being able to heat a whole house. And for the low carbon scenarios, for at least the scenarios we didn't make ourselves, we used another one called the long-term transition 2050, which is available in this paper. And what you find in the end is that your impact is the product of all these various variables you actually looked at. So every of these variables will be able to reduce your impact. You can just reduce, you can change your fuel, you can reduce your floor area, which means you can be more people per household. And you can also reduce the demand by insulating houses in a better way. So all of this combined leads us to what our picture is in 2050. To start with the living space, so this is the per capita floor area of buildings in square meter per capita. In 2020, we're at about 60, and that's also including office space. So if you look only at the homes, it's the orange and the yellow areas. So we're at about 45 for the functional region. For Luxembourg, it's much higher, but it takes into account the functional region 1, which is in hatched here, and the Luxembourg share of per-capita, let's say, in yellow. We want to reduce this to 35 square meter, which is easier to do if you take the functional area, which is harder to do if you take only Luxembourg, because the reduction will be higher. Yeah, some of that we will be able to do also by reusing some commercial and office space and converting that into housing. One of the main case studies of the third phase of the project was the commercial area of Futs, which has, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 places for parking, has huge areas, surface areas of commercial activities, which could probably be converted into a small, eco-friendly village. We're thinking of this 15-minute city model, which you may have heard about, to imagine the housing of tomorrow. It's basically places where you wouldn't even have need for a car, where cars would probably be forbidden anyway, or you would have very little space to park, but where everything would be done, everything would be built to be able to move around, to go shopping, for your daily activities, and go about your daily activities without the need for a car. So cars and buildings were really the two big blocks of this work. Cars come later, so just a little bit of patience. Yeah, and the residential housing consumption would decrease a lot. So far, it's not so good in Luxembourg. Luxembourg, we have this solid line here in black for the single-family houses, and in dot for the multi-family houses. Most single-family houses, at least before 2000, were really badly insulated. They were probably built a long time ago, where insulation was not really an issue, or not really thought of, so to say. Today, the average is probably around 220 kilowatt-hour per square meter per year, where it's less than half for multi-family homes. And it's a bit lower for the functional area. So it's quite a challenge, because by default, if we keep houses as they are today, it will be impossible to decarbonize Luxembourg. You need this heavy amount of renovation over the next 30 years. Yeah, so I can give you the time series for the various indicators, but I didn't plot them here. I plotted them for cars. And what it does, in terms of energy use for housing in Luxembourg in a functional area. So here at the very bottom, we have, well, it's not good to start with older, but let's say the dark yellow here is heating oil. So it's all the emissions, sorry, it's not emissions, it's the consumption. So it's in terawatt hours. It's all the consumption of fuel oil that we have in functional area. In yellow, we have gas. In red, we have biomass. In green, on top, we have electricity. And then we also have the electricity for non-heating. So all the use of electricity for appliances will be in the purple here. And everything else in other, which also accounts for solar thermal, which we know is not really efficient in Luxembourg, but yeah, it's a very thin slice. And the main thing to do is to phase out fuel oil, as the most carbon intensive fuel has to disappear completely by 2050. So that's our main lever of action. Most of that could be replaced directly by heat pumps in pink, and gas would undertake a much slower decay to 2050, with a little bit of gas remaining in 2050 for houses that couldn't have this this fuel switching. And that we would, with this kind of very drastic image, we would be able to fit our housing part into a 1.5 ton of CO2 box, since we have mostly probably half a ton on average coming from housing heating. And what's good is that since you're phasing out fossil fuels, and fossil fuels have a lot of other environmental externalities, you would also be able to reduce other environmental impacts. So decarbonization, as we see in general, has a lot of co-benefits in terms of environmental impacts. In terms of social impacts, it's a different question. We have some social indicators that we could use that we haven't used in this project because we didn't have the time, but it's a whole other topic that we could probably take another time. And there are some indicators that would be quite interesting to integrate. Mobility. Regarding mobility, we have done more or less the same thing. I don't really want to go into detail here, but it's mostly, leaving cars, switching the mode of car usage. Use more other mobility, soft mobility means, and increase the occupancy rate. That's also quite important. Car sharing. This is the distribution of cars we imagined between 2020 and 2025, with a huge increase in electric cars. Very small amount of cars coming using a hydrogen powertrain. For many reasons, hydrogen will probably not be the light mobility of the future. Again, that's another discussion, but yeah. And we see a little bit of natural gas that could be used for long distance transport for people who still need to do a lot of driving that electric could not satisfy. But by 2050, most of the fleet should be electric if we want to have any hope of being low carbon. I can give you some more details on the factors we used for CO2 equivalent, but I won't take too much time. I'll probably pass on this as well. This is the demand in mobility, and this time it's in billion passenger kilometer between 2020 and 2025, actually 90 because we have the data, and we see that most of it is covered by cars, and has always been covered by cars since we started having cars in the 60s, 70s. And this should change. The rate is actually quite positive, and has mostly been since 1990 and keeps increasing. Cars everywhere in Luxembourg, we have the highest rate of car ownership in Europe. That has to change. So we plan also on reducing the stock of cars, again, because there's no other way to reach our decarbonization targets, and to replace that with other modes. Bike would probably be the main. It's probably the one that's booming the most between now and 2050. Not because we expect everyone to be sporty, but because e-bikes, as we see, is actually quite a good way to replace most of car trips. I will pass the agricultural sector because I don't think we have time. I don't think I'm the best one to talk about this, but we can talk about food later. And carbon uptake, we have imagined how Luxembourg could start capturing most of the carbon it emits through green roofs, grassland, arable land, trees and meadows, hedge and trees, and riparian buffers. Riparian buffers is all the areas you have next to rivers that should be protected, first to protect biodiversity, but that actually happens to be a quite good way to capture carbon. And for that, this increase in uptake, which means negative emissions, will probably increase 2050 if we take the right decisions to do this. Right, so if we put all of this together, we have some interventions. Okay, I let those slides, but honestly, it's not really important. We have our footprint of 2020, 15.5 tons of CO2 equivalent, and we want to be at 1.6 in 2050. Yeah, in 2050. The thing is that most interventions will not be coming from one actor. Some interventions are something the public could do. So individual actions such as replacing car with train, stopping to eat as much meat as we do today. Start using second-hand website to buy clothes, buy consumption products. And that's what we qualified as individual and behavioral actions. And then there's the whole public and systemic actions. For example, no fuel tourism incentive, which would be aligning the prices of fuel with surrounding countries. And the same with tobacco and all the reasons why other people come here, because that still counts into this carbon footprint. As I said, it's still with the statistical statistical effect of cross-border commuters and logistics. And you have Decarbonization of public services, that's quite an important one. Decarbonization of our electricity supply, and what we call rest of measures, which could probably come as many other options. But honestly, if we start making the full list, it's going to be quite long. And then we also have the combined ones. Mobility combined measure means both the deployment of more charging station, electrification of the fleet of cars, reducing the amount of car per person, which means also better urban planning. So this is a bit of a box that contains a lot of interventions. Another box here is housing combined measure. It's the one that I showed you before. It includes renovation, changing the fuel mix, so banning fossil fuel for heating, and also proposing housing that is more climate compatible in sense. Yeah, so you can already think of all the well-being implications in all these boxes, and we have only discussed it briefly in the reports. We have not quantified any of it, which would be very interesting to do. So here the public, systemic, and combined ones, here the full list. And if you do it year after year, you see something like this, where you would here in this case have also the timing that I presented you earlier. But again, that's starting to be a bit too much now. We often got the remark that this is completely unrealistic and very drastic. I have to tell you that another group has this shape for carbon emissions, which is even more drastic. They imagine that especially industry in Luxembourg could decarbonize within the next 5 years, which appears, I think, unrealistic in the sense that you have a lot of momentum, especially in the industry sector, to make investments, since all investments have to have a return. So there's probably a lot of governmental actions that could be done at this point. All right, so that's it's 43 now, so I have to finish to wrap up some conclusions. We realized that all of these actions actually involve a lot of coordination between the regulatory bodies, between citizens and industry. So there's a lot to do, but we should be careful that not one of these actors has to wait or wants to wait that another one starts the work before doing its own. The responsibility is shared. The problem is that a lot of this involves long-lived infrastructure, buildings first, but also roads, railroads, parking lots, everything you can think of. And since the urgency is starting to be quite clear, and that we only have now 27 years to 2050, this is going to be a problem. Now the challenge for this was to have data from multiple sources. We have to think in life cycle terms. That's another key takeaway. Kelsey, just before we started, you asked me how we calculate carbon footprints, including supply chains. Well, this is how we do it. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty between these calculations, but that's continuously being refined. There's also this difference between territorial and production-based emissions versus consumption-based accounting. Both methods are useful because if we want to keep our industry in Luxembourg, we also have to look at the production-based accounting and territorial emissions, because we're going to export most of our stuff to the world. And if we can claim that what we make is cleaner than what the world makes, it's also a good reason to keep our industry on site. And all these levers are ultimately important. So that's where I wanted to stop. If you want, we can talk about the well-being implications of all this. I know there's probably a lot to think of, but thank you, and we can pass the questions now.
First off, thank you very much, Thomas. There's so much information in there. It's really impressive. I haven't thought about it in anywhere near this level of detail. So I'm going to have to review. Is there one location for all of this information?
Yes.
Do you have one project website?
Yes. I think I wrote, there's the link at the beginning of the Luxembourg in Transition project, and all the reports are available. We have 3 reports. We also have, I know it's long reports and it's quite heavy. We also have presentations, videos of our work, so where you could also find the information.
And if somebody wanted to, try to extend some of what you've done to other countries, would there be a way to where would you suggest people start?
Good question. In fact, this has been inspired by similar works, not done for countries, but for cities. There's the Grand Paris and Grand Genève, so Greater Paris and Greater Geneva projects that have, I think, that have been finished since a few years now, that do more or less the same kind of analysis to understand how big urban poles, which are by default, by construction, almost high carbon emitting, could probably reduce their emissions. So this has been inspired by such work. At the country level, then it's more or less the work of national agencies to propose energy climate national plans. That has to do with the UN, and there's probably a lot of decarbonization scenarios you could find from think tanks, from research centers. So usually these scenarios look at the energy system, because that's where you would actually be, killing more birds with one stone, because energy is a bit everywhere. But you could find more integrated works. I don't want to be too long, but if you look at integrated assessment models, which try to actually have all these aspects together in one box, this is where you would find this kind of studies.
Okay, thank you. So everyone, please feel free to raise your hand or to type in the chat box. Although if you type there, it's best still if you read it out. So hands are preferred, but so we'll get started. So Francesco, you had your hand raised first. If you'd like to go, I'll unmute myself if you want to unmute myself.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's an impressive amount of information that is quite difficult to grasp. But there is one data that, one figure that actually captured my attention. We used to think that traveling by plane is the big devil, and we should all stop and start using train. But then when I look at one of your slides, the decarbonization target to meet the Paris Agreement 2-degree scenario, you were showing basically the contribution of various sectors of our life to the carbon footprint. Basically, after housing, the biggest share is domestic mobility, so cars, but most all consumption goods. So my question is, you didn't actually comment on this, but would it be possible to disaggregate further within these boxes to see what are we consuming that associates so much CO2 equivalent per capita per year compared to, for instance, the planes? I mean, we're talking about 19% of the total CO2 emissions compared to the 10% of the planes. So after the heating of the houses, I would check what we can cut in our consumption.
Yes, there are two questions in one. The first one is, yes, of course, you can look into details into what is actually consumed, and we realize that clothing is actually a significant one. Then comes hygiene products and furniture. But first, when the second question is, when comparing with airplanes, it's true that flying is not that much when you take an average person. But in fact, if you even look at the global level, most people have never flown in their lives, right? So the difference here is that, and I think that would be my answer, is that most people consume everyday goods, such as we all need clothes, we all need furniture and hygiene products. But a small minority of us fly. In Luxembourg, it's less true than in other countries, but it's still true. And the fact that the average looks low is that the standard deviation is much higher than with the consumption of products. And on the slides that I passed very quickly, this one. And flying is actually I mean, in terms of grams CO2 equivalent per person, it's still lower than cars. So per kilometer, it's still better to fly than to drive alone. So the factor is not that high. The problem is that when you fly, you will do thousands of kilometers probably at once, and that's probably the issue. So that would be my answer.
Thanks, Thomas. Next up is Pascal. Please feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Thank you, Thomas, for the presentation. It's very dense, and it's, yeah, I have read the report before, Luxembourg under transition, so it confirms the findings you had, and it even extends them. I have a question concerning housing. When you show the two graphs that actually emissions are going, energy consumption is going up for residential housing, and your data starts 1990.
Yes.
I go back. Yes, 1990.
Yeah.
Do you have anything before that? Do we know what houses were consuming before 1990, back in the 70s, back after the Second World War, or even further? My point being is, you said that the data is life cycle assessment, but did old houses not consume far much energy than houses built in the 80s, 90s of last century? And in a life cycle perspective, do you integrate all the gray energy that is contained in isolating those houses, in triple glazing, and in having these very carbon intensive building sites we have now with all this excavation? What I want to, my hypothesis is that old buildings, which are in full stone buildings, are much less carbon intensive than anything we build passively now.
Yes, very good question. That's true. Old buildings are probably much less carbon intensive compared to the ones we do now, because of the carbon intensity of the materials we use for insulation, among other things. This is only space heating, so it excludes the construction part. And I don't think we have assumed a significant increase in construction of houses carbon intensity for the future, and that's actually probably a blind spot from our side. But we have studies that show that a new house built today is probably 50% more, even double the carbon intensity of an old house per square meter.
Yeah.
But normally you catch up on that carbon debt over the life cycle, over the lifetime of the building, because you will save energy. But it takes some time. It's not from year zero that it's better.
But old houses lasted much longer and had a floor share per inhabitant, which was much lower.
Yeah.
So it's just, if we really decide that everything needs to be passive and needs to be fossil fuel based insulation, then I think that somewhere we are reality blind and we didn't do the whole calculation.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, I would agree. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Germain. You're up next. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yep, thank you very much. So Germain from Centre of Luxembourg. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Personally, I'm really interested in this subject. I have some points I would like to read on Ms. Madame Juncker point. Those new houses basically do not last as the old ones. If you take those insulations, they do not hold for 50 years, basically 10, 15 years, and they start to crumble down. So I think if you do your models, basically the carbon input needs really to be taken into account. This is not so evident. Also, if you look for an electric car, you need to drive a lot to, let's say, to fulfill this carbon debt which you have when you buy an electrified car. So it's not so white black. But basically, I have more interesting other type of question. Basically, in your estimations, currently, how much tons per head are we, let's say, consuming, and to how many tons per head do we need to go down into 2050? I think, let's say, in Germany, for instance, there's some scientific who say that we would need to go that. Germany would need to go down to 3 tons per year per person. And if you look at let's say of the consummation of a poor household in Germany, so no flights, no Mallorca, no holidays, nothing, just a car with some kilometers, basically they're already at 6 tons.
Yeah.
So I would be interested to see how you see this. And then secondly, perhaps I've missed it, but perhaps it's in the report. But many things which you're proposing there, which are very sensible, or which you're analyzing, for instance, if you take bicycles, I think everybody thinks that bicycles should be more important. But first, the infrastructure needs to be there. For the moment, the infrastructure is not there. Ergo, people do not take the bike, or just a smaller, just a really small courses, or let's say only fair small amount of people. So yes, so all this also will cost energy, will cost money, will cost time. Have you plotted this type of developments into your analysis? Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, just to go in order of so the first remark is really good. Actually, with most technologies we develop today, be it renewable energy, new housing, electric cars, most of the emissions happen upstream. That's the objective, is to have no emissions, hopefully over the whole life cycle, but especially during the use phase. And that's why it's really important to use life cycle assessment to go and look at actually what is being done upstream, especially in the case of electric cars, where the electricity comes from matters a lot. If you have an electric car powered by coal power, it's probably not as good, and almost probably the same as a diesel car. There's also a matter of, anyway, but it's very important, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's really the essence of what we're doing in my group. This objective of 2 tons, it varies a lot. There's no real objective. The thing is that every ton of CO2 avoided is good to take. We said 2 because we estimate the uptake capacity of the planet by 2050 to be able to absorb 2 tons per person, when we will be 9 or 10 billion. And you're right that if you do everything that is in your power to, not travel, to live in a small apartment, which probably be a quite sad life, eat tofu all day or whatever, you will not get down to less than 5 or 6 tons. It's true not only for Germany, but for most other countries. And that's because there's a lot of these systemic effects that also have to happen. The fact that you already live in Luxembourg means that you're already above 2 tons, because all the public services you're using have a footprint of 2 tons. So even if you do nothing, if you don't have a house or not a car, and you don't eat, you would already be at that level, which really shows the fact that everyone needs to be involved in this effort, which doesn't mean that we have to wait for the government to do something. We also have a role as citizens, but everyone has to move in the same direction together to get to the 2 tons. If I do everything I can do alone, I will get to 5 or 6. If the government does everything they can do alone, we will get to 7 or 8. But if we do it together, it's a combination effect. And the last thing on bicycles, the main obstacle actually for the low use, to the use of bicycle, is that people fear cars, and that infrastructure doesn't allow us to bike safely, let's say, in most cities. There's this sentence, that paint is not infrastructure. If you just paint a bike lane, it doesn't mean much, because you're still at risk. There's a lot that we have to do to make it better. And just to finish on that, there's also a movement called Copenhagenize. I think it's Copenhagenize Europe, or Copenhagenize, and that really advocates for the best examples we have in Europe, which is Copenhagen and Amsterdam, which really design cities first for pedestrians and bikes, and cars come as an afterthought in the process. And that I totally agree with you, that I don't really feel safe, especially at night. Biking, it's not really, I don't really want to do it, right? And that's also part of this process of making a future more desirable for low carbon actions.
Thanks, Thomas. So we have hit 6 o'clock. We still have a question, and there was another person who just wrote in the chat. So if it's okay with you, we'll take a couple more questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Chiara, you are up next.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. I just have a comment and a question. Apologies because my video is not working. My comment is about your consideration concerning the flight versus clothes and consumption expenditure. You said that we do not necessarily need to fly, but we need to buy clothes, for example. But this is true up to a certain extent, because if we want a good functioning labor market in Europe, we need flights, especially in a country like Luxembourg, that is a country of expatriates. So people fly not to go on holidays necessarily nowadays. That's probably a little bit of an outdated view of flying, if you allow me. At the same time, we don't all need to buy fast fashions. So I think there is room for adjustment in this respect, especially if you tell us that you have found out that fast fashion is actually responsible for more emissions than flying. So that's my first point. Then my second point is a question about the way you measure greenhouse gases emissions. I see that here in this graph, for example, you also have PM. Is this small particles?
Yes.
So is there a way, basically, when you talk about emissions, you consider only greenhouse gases, but also other pollutants like PM and the effects on the environment, even if PM does not contribute necessarily to the greenhouse effect. So how do you deal with these issues of environmental degradation, which are perhaps, if I understand correctly, not accounted directly in GHG, but might affect the abilities of the environment to store carbon, for example?
Yes, it's a lot of questions. Yeah, for the first one, of course, I'm not saying that we should stop flying overnight. I totally understand that. I'm also in that case that for family reasons, we also have to fly once in a while. The thing is that I think it's France. It's half of the flights are for business reasons and half for personal reasons. We could already look at the business trips. That's one first thing. That's, you know, there's a lot of universities and research centers and probably companies that have started storing decision tree to know whether you should fly or not to a meeting. It's something more and more. You should start looking where you could cut flights first. Not saying that you shouldn't see your family. That's kind of obvious. But we also have to think back and to understand that it's great what we have had, but this internationalization really happened with cheap fossil fuels. It was not really possible to do this before, let's say, before the war, for at least for everyone. But since the 60s, the 70s, cheap fossil fuels have permitted this great thing that is international exchange. So we made our lives dependent on fossil fuels because now we have, you know, international or even intercontinental families that have formed based on that luck that we had the cheap fossil energy. But now this is becoming our problem because we know that cheap fossil energy is not a good thing. So it's also a bit of a reasoning like that. We have to look at the longer history. Yeah, and then on the greenhouse gas and particulate matter, yes, we accounted for particulate matter emissions also over the life cycle. So some of this is actually not happening on site, although for housing in this case, it is because it's mostly the combustion of fuel, oil, and gas. And it's actually an issue we have a lot in life cycle assessment, is that these different indicators don't really mean, or actually don't really have the implications at the same scale. Greenhouse gas emissions is an issue that is global and long-term. And that's why it's also a priority, because once it's emitted, it's really hard to get back. Particulate matters, it's a local and short-term problem. It is a problem because a lot of people suffer from respiratory diseases, but the fact that it's, you know, if you emit something and if you have particulate matter emissions in a place where not many people live, 2 weeks after there's no more particles in the air, it's a different problem. So we keep this indicator separate, although a lot of people would like to see a single score of environmental impact, but it's not really possible because of that. And no, we haven't taken into account the fact that some environmental problems might affect the fact that greenhouse gases cannot be absorbed as much anymore. And that's a methodological tricky question, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so I think...
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have a comment in the chat. A question from Tiziana Tamburini. She had to leave, unfortunately. She says, how to leverage individual behaviors that are effective and at the same time not frustrating. Would not be essential a large and extensive public policy, just thinking housing and expensive cars in Luxembourg. In terms of civic engagement, what about energetic communities? Is there any room for it here in Luxembourg? Yeah, so I think you get, things that go together.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything like that? And maybe you can speak to it. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, well, maybe this is more personal. I haven't seen the scientific literature about it, but the fact that you can get to surround yourself with people who think the same is very powerful to me. You cannot change all of society at once, but you can have a group of friends, of colleagues, or join an association where everyone is like-minded and have this kind of topics in mind, which make it easier to adopt certain behaviors. I think the power of community is quite strong in this case. Also because it just makes it just normal to behave in a certain way. If all your friends are biking, or if all your friends eat very little meat, then you will eat very little meat, and that will not even occur to you that it's something weird. And I trust in the power of surrounding yourself with people who think the same. And today it's possible with a lot of associations. I'm thinking of the youth today in Luxembourg. There's Years for Climate. I was at a roundtable this morning organized by Action for Future or something like that, which is not a group of young people, students in Luxembourg. I think the young communities are taking this problem and making it theirs, which I think is very hopeful. And they really have this mentality of, if you're among peers, then it becomes a normal thing to do. So that would be one way to fight the frustration, in a sense.
Yeah, I like that. And I feel like it flows into a question I was going to ask. We're running a little bit low on time, but maybe as nobody else is asking. So one of our colleagues studies the rebound effect. So if you make cars more efficient, people ultimately end up driving further. Is this something, but it's behavioral, right? Related to incentives. Is this something you have accounted for, thought about, and what can we do?
It's from the papers I know, it's difficult to quantify rebound effect in a systematic way, or at least you would need at least a somewhat complicated economic model to do it. But it's true. And the problem is that if you save money, for example, you will reinvest it somewhere else. There's a strong correlation between income and carbon footprint, just due to the fact that if you have a lot of purchasing power, then you will mobilize a lot of products, services, just by the fact that you're spending. That's a very difficult thing. And if you save in one category, you will probably catch up in another one. And even if you actually put your money in investments, this money will work in a sense and also be associated with investments you make, which also generate emissions. So it's very difficult to avoid rebound effect, and even more so to quantify it. But we definitely thought about it. The thing is that the economic dimension in our exercise here is quite weak. We haven't really monetarized almost any of it, I think. So, due to resource and time constraints.
That's very helpful. Gives me a nice idea. I hadn't thought about the rebound effect really spilling over into all the dimensions of your life, and it completely makes sense. So that's great. If maybe you have any closing remarks, I think we're done with questions. Otherwise, thank you very much for this really valuable, insightful presentation. on what's going on in Luxembourg and what we can do about it.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for inviting me and for the great discussion as well.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Thomas.
Good evening.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We will be putting this recording up online very soon. And we have our next seminar scheduled, although it's not up on the website. We'll get it out to you very soon. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.